Hey, welcome to my streamers. You are listening to Jack Stockwell at Global Affairs Unfiltered. And at the same time, I want to welcome the K-Talk audience. Hopefully that they are there as well. I understand the tower isn't working, so until they get the tower to broadcast, I guess I'm online. Sorry about yesterday. When the station, when the equipment is turned off at the end Sunday night, there's nobody there to turn it on Sunday morning. So that's why we were, just on the stream yesterday. For those of you who are listening on air, and for those of you listening over the internet, one way to get better sound, better quality to what you're listening to, is to go to youtube.com/Global Affairs Unfiltered. And then if you sign up for notifications, every time I do something, you will be notified and you can listen to it. They're all being recorded. You can listen to them later. But, it's a constant struggle. It's a constant battle to try and keep K-Talk up and running, and I applaud their efforts. I know it's not that easy a thing to do. In fact, I know it's rather difficult. But I've been with K-Talk now, being a part of the broadcast family, since March of 1995. So that's 30 years. 30 years this last March. And I'm glad they've been patient with me because I haven't always been the easiest person to deal with myself. So the title of today's program is, Why Do People Believe the Opposite of What's Happening? And regardless of where you're looking, what subjects you're coming up with, it seems the majority of people, although some of them are beginning to wake up, it seems the majority of people are just locked on these nonsense propaganda concepts that keep coming out of Western media. And by Western media, I don't just mean what you find in the United States, but what you see coming out of France and Germany and England. The same kind of propaganda that the West can do no wrong, and anybody who doesn't agree with the policies of London and Wall Street are of the devil. So I want to go into these concepts as they relate to Russia, the Ukraine, to Israel, to Gaza, to Los Angeles, what's going on there now, and what's coming down the pike here later this summer that you want to be aware of. And I do this, as you well know, I don't get paid to do this. I've never been paid in 30 years of radio broadcasting to do this kind of stuff. I do it because I have this heartfelt concern that people think, that people start thinking, they use their gray matter to actually begin to analyze, not from a propaganda view, because I was listening this morning for an hour on Fox and Friends as well as CNN, and as long as I could take it, MSNBC. And they're all saying essentially the same thing from slightly different angles. The Democrats hate the Republicans, and the Republicans hate the Democrats, but when it comes to certain issues, they're just in bed with each other, especially the War Party. And the War Party is pretty well represented as what happened a year ago when Netanyahu stood before the U.S. Congress, and the absolute majority of the Republicans as well as the Democrats, in his 1-hour presentation, gave him 58 standing ovations. That's like one almost every minute. Those are the people that I'm concerned about, and some of the leading figures, especially Lindsey Graham, Blumenthal, and their acts of treason recently over in the Ukraine. Now, we're always wondering what's behind what? Who's behind what? What's behind what? Who's pulling the strings? Who's pulling the people who are pulling the strings? And the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, And you know I have a lot of respect for him. I consider him the #1 statesman on the face of the planet, even ahead of Putin. We don't have any statesmen in the United States, unfortunately, that I can think of. I like Dennis Kucinich. I might consider him a statesman. And then also, then of course, certain podcast personalities like Douglas McGregor, Larry Johnson, I consider them well-informed reporters. I don't know necessarily statesmen. But Lavrov yesterday named the British as the key to the major strategic destabilization efforts going on in Russia right now, including the attacks on the Russian bridges, the railroads, and the strategic bomber sites. When you hear about the damage that was done to, I think it was about 7 planes now is the official number. The West wants you to believe it was over 40, that they took out 1/3 of the strategic bomber capabilities of Russia. If that had actually happened, if they had actually taken out 40 of them, the nukes would already have been launched. And I wouldn't be doing this program this morning because there would be no electricity to be found anywhere. And you would have had a cold shower this morning instead of hot water. So when a nuclear-empowered country like England uses a non-nuclear proxy like the Ukraine to attack 1/3 of the strategic triad of a nuclear-armed country, I don't know how else to describe that except insane madness. And they didn't just do that. They attacked the Kerch Bridge. They attacked the railroads. They have now found sufficient amounts of, I think it's C4 plastic explosive in a warehouse close to where one of the bridges blew up that dropped on an airplane, that dropped on a railroad cars. The bridges blew up as the train was going underneath the bridges, killing innocent Russian citizens. Now you put yourself in Putin's place and you wonder how long they're going to put up with this. Well, it's very important that Lavrov came out and said it's the British who are doing this. We know it's the British. And instead of lumping the United States with the British, which of course is the truer statement, he just insisted, oh, who knows? Maybe some U.S. intelligence services are participating there by inertia, but the British are 100%. So he was speaking in Moscow at the Tsargard's Institute Forum on the Future, 2050. And in answer to the question that was posed by Larry Johnson, who's a regular on the Napolitano podcast, he was present at this seminar, this presentation. Lavrov said, Russia has always been a leader in turn. Now this is, this is Johnson's question to Lavrov. Russia has always been a leader in terms of coordinating both diplomatic and military efforts. What problems or obstacles or challenges do you envision as Russia now shifts from a special military operation to a counterterrorism operation? And Johnson is a former analyst for the CIA, co-founder of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and is somewhat in regular dialogue with Schiller Institute's Helga Zepp-LaRouche. So Lavrov developed the nature of the terrorist operations by locating the methods that were used by Kyiv as never primarily militarily, but with the attacks on the civilian bridges and the railroads in Bryansk and Kursk, he says the naked form is now clear. He said, in the Kursk region, we all saw what the Ukrainian Nazis did. There's not a single object there that could be presented to the viewer as an object related to military operations. And at the last meeting with members of the government, the president very clearly stated what conclusion we had come to or are coming to and will proceed from. But you are absolutely right, speaking to Johnson. This threat is quite serious, and it's obvious that everything is being done by the Ukrainian side. But it would be helpless without the support, I wanted to say, of the Anglo-Saxons. But now it'll have to be without the Saxons, simply without the support of the British. Although who knows, maybe some U.S. intelligence services are participating there by inertia, but the British are 100%. Now, there can be no competent U.S. strategic doctrine or foreign policy which does not proceed from the understanding of the nature of and the reasons for the irreconcilable principal differences in moral character between the British monarchy and the constitutional Federal Republic of the United States. And it's a corollary at some point that there can be no competent understanding of the United States by any other nation unless that nation recognizes the very national republic form of the government of the United States and its most vital interests. And at issue is nothing less than fundamental that two mutually exclusive concepts of man and nature exist between the British Empire and the Constitutional Republic of the United States. So, we started off by asking, how do people believe the opposite of what is really happening? I had a conversation last night. My last patient of the day happens to be a good friend. He's more than a patient. He's a patient and a friend. And we often have this discussion when he comes in. I try to avoid it because I just want to shake him. So after I had worked on him and his wife, he says, all right, what do you think about the latest? When do you think Russia's finally going to surrender? And he's serious. He's absolutely serious. And no matter what point I bring out, what's being printed even in Ukrainian press, let alone Russian press, what's being printed in RT, what's being printed in the New York Times that's finally starting to print the truth to some limited degree, what's printed in the Times of Israel or Haaretz or Jerusalem Post, what's being printed in Die Welt, the London Times, that indicate Ukraine is in some serious, serious trouble. He still believes it's the other way around. And whenever I make a point, as I just did, he doesn't argue the point. He just dismisses it as propaganda, and he reaches forward and puts his hand on my shoulder. Now, Jack, now, you don't understand how bad things are in Russia. Well, I have some friends who were over there for an 8-day tour of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a few other places. And they had a tour guide because there was a group of them. And there was no place they couldn't go. They went into the Kremlin, walked around inside the Kremlin. They went to some of the palaces in St. Petersburg and some of the other places that are, tourist centers. And they said, this one person said, Jack, you're absolutely right. What? We were shocked by the level of Russian culture. I said, what do you mean? Well, they're happy, and they're all over the place. And there's stores and malls, shopping centers, big stadiums for their games. They said, comparing 1-to-1 with Americans, they seem happier. They're excited. The trains are on time. There's taxis all over the place. Did you have some conversations with the Russian citizens? Oh, yeah. A surprising number of them speak English. And I say, why is that surprising? Now, if there was a large number of Americans that spoke Russian, that would be surprising. But why would you be surprised by a lot of Russians speaking English? It's the same thing I've experienced. I've been all over Western Europe. The only place in Western Europe I haven't been, I think, is Portugal. And several times. And no matter where I go, south of France, interior of Germany, a complete circumnavigational trip of Switzerland, which didn't take very long, England, Scotland, Well, of course, England and Scotland. A surprising. Oh, how do you know it is working? Forgive me for a second while I mute my voice on the radio. A surprising number of them are speaking English. And some of these people, like I was in Spain last September, and a country you don't hear too much about anymore relative to the European Union and what's going on with Ukraine, because Spain doesn't have anything to do with it. And Spain has very strong, tight immigration laws, which is why Spain is not filling up with Africans, like Germany and France and England are. So, I make that statement simply as an observation, nothing else. And it was just, this fellow, just no matter what I said, he would come back with some kind of an idea that, Jack, you just don't understand the Russians. Jack, you just don't understand what's really going on. And he would go on like that for a while anyway, just dismissing anything that I could possibly say in contrast to the points that he was trying to make. And so I had to make a bet with him. And we finished off our discussion last night before he and his wife left, where I said, okay, at some point in the future, I said, I think in the next month or two, they're going to finally declare the end of the war. And they're going to declare Russia as the winner. And if Russia's the winner, you have to take me and whoever's with me at the time out to dinner. Now, I don't mean whoever's with me. I think some of you know very well who I'm referring to. I don't know that she wants me to mention her name on the radio. And if it turns out that Ukraine has won, then I will reciprocate, and we will take you out to dinner. And he said, oh, yeah, but that's not going to be, the war is going to go on for another year and a half, probably 2 years. And so I said, well, if you think the Ukraine is doing so well against Russia, why is it going to take another year and a half? When there's 150,000 more soldiers that just showed up to fight for the Russians. He says, Jack, you don't understand. He keeps saying this over and over again. These are people who are taken out of prisons. And I just, for Pete's sake. These are people who, most of them worked for the government, and being sworn in as loyal members of the Russian Federation Army are getting paid 4 times what they got paid. 400% more than they were getting paid as a truck driver or whatever else for their nation. And that's why they're taking a chance on the front lines, because of pay. They're getting paid this extra money. And he says, well, the government can't pay it because the government's broke. And I said, oh, come on. International press, I don't care what country it's from, is talking about how all these sanctions against Russia have backfired, and that Russia right now is producing in 3 months the armament that it takes the entire European Union to produce in 1 year. And it's not some biased propaganda center somewhere, in Russia that's printing this kind of information. International organizations, NGOs that watch this stuff are printing this kind of information. And that there's another 500,000 Russian troops ready to come into the Ukraine. And he said, no, the Russian army is running for their lives. They're surrendering. They're deserting. So I said, we're just going to have to agree to disagree, I guess, because that is not what I pick up in all the research that I'm doing. So why do people believe the opposite of what's happening? Well, the people who are the influencers, of course, are being paid. If you've been watching the riots taking place in L.A., and the peaceful demonstration where these rioters are destroying buildings, burning cars, smashing storefront windows in their peaceful demonstration against ICE. The organizers, they're paid. They're paid to do this, just like Antifa was before, or Black Lives Matter, 4 or 5 years, or during the 2020 election year. And that's not a statement of bias. It came out in the news. These are paid mercenaries. And I have no doubt but that some of the leaders of what's going on in LA right now were involved in these other operations. And they have their own little private lives, but they get called up because of the excessive amount of money they get paid to show up and lead these kinds of demonstrations. And of course, they show up with ski masks or some other way to hide their identity because they know what they're doing is illegal and they know they're going to be picked up and thrown in jail. So today, as far as LA is concerned, I think there's, was it 500, 700 Marines from Camp Pendleton are supposed to be there on the front line. Listen to that, front line in downtown LA. Gee, not since Rodney King. 700 Marines showing up on the streets along with the National Guard to take care of this problem at hand with these demonstrations that are going on against ICE. And then the normal stuff that the news shows, you know, the waving of the Mexican flag and the burning of the American flag. And again, a lot of this stuff is propaganda in the sense of the viewpoint that they're trying to present. So, backing away from LA, I think I've got some more stuff on that. But what I want to talk about, Simon Tisdall is the foreign affairs commentator for The Guardian, one of the major news sources in the UK. And he condemned the Strategic Defense Review, the defense strategy document that was released by Keir Starmer about a week ago, for risking the normalization of nuclear warfare. Starmer came out and said, we need to clean the mothballs out of our nukes. He didn't say it that way, but that's what he was talking about. And so plans by Keir Starmer's government to modernize and potentially expand Britain's nuclear weapons arsenal unveiled in the 2025 Strategic Defense Review seriously undermines international proliferation efforts. So Tisdall wrote in his column. He says they fuel a global nuclear arms race led by US, China, and Russia, and they increase the chances that lower yield, so-called tactical nukes will be deployed and detonated in conflict zones. This dangerous path leads in only one direction, towards the normalization of nuclear warfare. The proposals in the Strategic Defense Review are a continuation of a redundant, inhuman, immoral, potentially international law-breaking deterrence policy that cash-strapped Britain can ill afford and will struggle to implement at cost and on time, and which perpetuates illusions about its global power status. So the movement out of, or reported by the Strategic Defense Review, that the Royal Air Force has a fleet of F-35As that can carry American-supplied B-61 nuclear bombs. And he said this is extremely chilling. He says he's also unable to break entirely from the UK NATO narrative about the supposed Russian threat. And he says that retaining nuclear weapons at current or increased levels does not make Britain safer. Their use would be immoral, irrational, and catastrophic. They are grossly expensive, consuming resources that the UK, facing painful treasury cuts again this week, could more sensibly be used to build hospitals and schools and properly equip the armed forces. It's uncertain how independent of the U.S. the British deterrent really is in practice. Does Starmer or Trump have the final word on use? Official secrecy prevents adequate democratic scrutiny, and the idea that nuclear warfare, once the taboo is broken, might somehow be contained or limited in a fast-track tick to oblivion. Gradual disarmament, not rearmament, is the only way to escape this nightmare. Nuclear warfare is the most immediate threat to life on Earth. Worry about that first. It's a shortcut to apocalypse now. So you see Starmer doing the same thing that Macron is doing, the same thing that Friedrich Merz is doing in Germany, with saying, okay, we're going to release the Kraken. We're going to release the this little tiny cruise missile that everybody's so upset about, and that it's just a little old Taurus, and we don't really need to worry that much about it. And so you find the leadership of these major nations, the coalition of the willing, the UK, France, Germany, Poland, and the Baltics, all coming together now, getting ready for war on Russia. Germany has sent a battle force of 5,000 into Poland on the Ukrainian border to come down and help out the Ukrainians. And this just, we're moving towards higher escalation, not de-escalation. And I think the time, I said this yesterday, I think the time right now is more worrisome than it was the 2 weeks before the inauguration back in January, when Biden had said, okay, you guys can have the long and short range, or the medium range missiles delivered to Ukraine for launching into Russia. And now, because they didn't get those, they did this last thing here a week ago Sunday, with smaller missiles, smaller drones, launched from trucks at various places around Russia, from the Kursk region all the way out to Irkutsk, over 4,000 kilometers. And so I can't sit back, as I did right after Trump's inauguration. I could kind of rest a little bit and wondered, what in the world am I going to talk about on my radio show? You know, if I'm not spreading fear and death and destruction, what are we going to talk about? But here it is. It's back in our lap. Now, I was going to get into the International Atomic Energy Agency's wanting to be involved with the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations. And also, Trump is telling Netanyahu that the United States is going to meet with Iran the day after tomorrow, I think. According to the Times of Israel, which is where that came from, said that Trump covered a variety of issues with Netanyahu, including the ongoing Iran nuclear talks. And he said, we're going to meet with Iran on Thursday. We're trying to make a deal so there's no destruction and death. Then he was asked by reporters about the still stuck hostage talks between Israel and Hamas, and Trump said, well, they're ongoing, and Iran is actually involved, he said, in these talks. We'll see what's going to happen with Gaza. We want to get the hostages back. He said the call with Netanyahu went very well. Otherwise, when he was asked about Israel's seizure of Greta Thunberg's little flotilla from Cyprus, I think is where they left, he said that Israel has enough problems right now without kidnapping Greta Thunberg. and then in true fashion, Trump says, she's a very strange person. But the important thing is that Trump used the word kidnapping. Now, Rafael Grossi, who's Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, gave an interview to Financial Times Friday, I think it was, which covered a full range of matters under the agency's purview, but his most interesting remarks came with respect to Iran. And you know that this is a rather strategic developing issue here between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And he said this, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon at this moment, but it has the material. And a bomb could emerge very swiftly. So he said that while President Trump's special envoy Witkoff has reopened the talks, Israel's threats to strike Iran's nuclear program means that the Iranian thing has incredible potential to become catastrophic. If there is a failure in negotiation, this will imply most probably military action. So worse, you know, Iran's nuclear capabilities can't be destroyed with a single surgical strike. Grossi said the most sensitive things are half a mile underground. He said, I've been there many times. To get there, you have to a spiral tunnel down, 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 and a single nuclear strike won't take it out. So Financial Times notes that many of Trump's critics say that Witkoff, who's a former property developer, I keep thinking of shopping malls when I hear property developer, lacks credentials to do what he's doing, but Grossi said this: I have seen cases where countries have to be convinced that they have to negotiate, but here's not the case. The talks are very serious. Witkoff is an extremely serious person. I don't subscribe to the idea that he's not. I cannot express political preferences, but what I can say is that Trump has triggered negotiations where there were none before, and this is objectively commendable. So then the Iranian foreign minister spokesperson, Baghaei, told reporters today that Iran will soon hand a counterproposal for a nuclear deal to the United States via Oman. Says the U.S. proposal is not acceptable to us. Well, you know what the U.S. proposal is: complete shutdown of nuclear development. It was not the result of previous rounds of negotiations. We will present our own proposal to the other side via Oman after it is finalized. This proposal is reasonable, logical, and balanced. And then he said, we must ensure before lifting of sanctions that Iran will effectively benefit economically and that its banking and trade relations with other countries will return to normal. All right, a little bit more here on Israel seizing the food boat that was headed to Gaza. Somewhere between the Sunday and Monday nights, in the dark of night, of course, they're not going to happen during the day, in international waters, Israel boarded and seized the Freedom Flotilla coalition boat that was headed to Gaza, bearing food and humanitarian aid. Well, remember what happened on June 8th? Back in 1967? Some of you, I don't have to tell you what happened. You know what happened in Mediterranean waters, in the Eastern Mediterranean, involving a U.S. naval ship called the Liberty. So at the same time, Israel is boarding and seizing this boat bearing food and humanitarian aid. And you're not going to find guns and bullets on this boat because they knew they were going to be boarded, hopefully to be checked and then allowed to go through. But it's a PR stunt because Israel is not going to allow these starving Gazans to get any food. But June 8th is also the anniversary of Israel's 1967 naval attack in the Mediterranean on the USS Liberty, killing 34 and injuring another 171 Americans. So, and I've got more to say about that here in a few minutes, but the Liberty anyway. But the Freedom Flotilla coalition activists, including our dearly beloved Greta Thunberg, 6 French nationals, one of whom is a member of the European Parliament, and 5 others are being taken to the port of Ashdod, where by the order of Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, anti-Semitic Greta and her Hamas-supporting friends are to be shown footage of the October 7th, 2023 assault on Israel by Hamas. We'll show you, we're going to show you who you're trying to feed, even though you've got this flotilla with food for these starving children, who of course had a big hand to play in the attack on Israel. We'll show you, because once you see our edited version of what happened that day, not what actually happened, but our edited version, you'll change your tune. So one Democratic state campaign cited an analysis by Dr. Ori Goldberg, a lecturer at Reichman University, that Israel's latest flight forward is indicative of a society about to fall apart. Wow. He said the attack on the Madeleine ship is such a sign of paranoia that shows fraying confidence that results in lashing out, all because of an unsustainable idea of transforming a pluralistic Palestine to an ethnocentric, chauvinistic nation-state of Israel, which the racists think can happen via ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing. Man, I couldn't have said that better if I had a year to prepare it. He alluded to the threats from within Netanyahu's coalition to vote this, I think it's tomorrow, for disbanding the Knesset and hold new elections. He says this: Israeli politics are imploding. Most parties, including the ultra-Orthodox ones, considered wedded to Netanyahu, are leaving the sinking ship of his government. They're not humanitarians. They smell the blood in the water. Time for an international coup de grace. So this Freedom Flotilla, of course, is not the only effort by concerned activists to attempt to break the blockade. Journalist Vanessa Beeley posted a video on X depicting 1,000 young people boarding buses in Tunisia bound for Egypt to break the siege. And of course, everyone knows that one stern phone call from U.S. President Trump to Netanyahu could end the genocide immediately. But unfortunately, our president is not going to do that because our president is owned by the Israeli lobby. They put up the money. I mean, Musk says Trump couldn't have won without his help and his money, which is probably true. But Trump could certainly not have won without the Israeli money and the AIPAC money and Adelson's money and whatever Jewish organizations there were at the time, because they knew that Trump would support whatever Israel was doing relative to Gaza and Palestine. And so it's no longer an issue for debate. Okay, the little spat that's going on between Gruesome Newsom, I think is what Trump calls him, and Trump, on the afternoon of June the 8th, which was Sunday, California Gavin Newsom, the governor, Gavin Newsom, sends this letter to President Trump requesting that the National Guard units that are involved in facilitating the immigration crackdown be removed from L.A. And according to several news reports, thousands of demonstrators were in the streets at several locations throughout L.A. on June 8th protesting this week's apparent shift in tactics for immigration enforcement by raiding workplaces in the garment district and also at construction supply stores such as Home Depot, where undocumented workers line up waiting for work. Well, Trump, for his part, posted on Truth Social, he said this Sunday afternoon: "We made a great decision in sending the National Guard to deal with the violent, instigated riots in California. If we had not done so, Los Angeles would have been completely obliterated." That might be a little overstatement. But I thought it was interesting that Trump refers to these protesters as a violent, instigated riot, when all the local news sources in LA said it is a peaceful demonstration. And you can see the burning cars, you can see the smoke rising up, you can see the damage to buildings. A peaceful demonstration to one person may not necessarily be described the same way to somebody else. But anyway, Trump, for his part, says that if we had not done so, LA would have been completely obliterated. The very incompetent governor, Gavin Newsom, and Mayor Karen Bass should be saying, "Thank you, President Trump. You're so wonderful. We could be nothing without you, sir." In pure Trumpism. Instead, they chose to lie to the people of California and America by saying that we weren't needed and that these are peaceful protests. Just look at the pictures and videos of the violence and destruction tells you all you need to know. End quote from President Trump on X. So according to the sources I have, as of June 9th, reporting had greatly exaggerated the violence, as it has been with the anti-genocide rallies, and the thousands of protesters were largely friends and neighbors of people who were being targeted for deportation and people who opposed the mass deportation policy. Now, that's not to say that things couldn't or didn't devolve rapidly. It's now being reported that 700 Marines are, I think, there now. For what isn't yet clear at the moment, but 700 Marines. If I had to deal with 700 National Guardsmen or 700 active duty Marines, I think I'd pick the National Guardsmen. However, though the majority of the people that were there, that were interviewed by various press agencies, as I said, were friends, neighbors, relatives who have a right to be there, protesting those who were being rounded up by ICE for deportation, trying to defend them. Now, at some certain point, the violence escalated on the 8th, on Sunday, seeming to indicate the introduction of, as I said earlier, the paid provocateurs who finally showed up, who were involved in setting multiple fires, including torching at least, I think, 4 of the 5 Waymo self-driving vehicles. They were throwing fireworks and rocks at the police. The fellow who was seen on the video throwing rocks at passing police cars has finally been picked up, or at least identified. No, I don't think he's been arrested yet. He's been identified, a $50,000, I think, bounty on his head, and so they're looking for him now. But they made this makeshift barrier using chairs from a public park to mark the battlefront. And from an overpass, protesters were throwing concrete blocks and the electric scooters onto the closed southbound 101 freeway, forcing the highway patrol officers in the area to seek cover. I saw a couple of pictures of that. You know, these little scooters, electric scooters, are all around town that you can rent for a certain amount of money and takes you where you want, and then you just leave it wherever you're going, because they're picking this stuff up with Wi-Fi. They know where their scooters are. These people were throwing these things off the overpass down onto the 101. So several blocks in downtown LA were closed to all traffic on Sunday evening, and then the stun grenades could be heard every few seconds, the big flashbang things in the downtown area. So the LAPD chief, Jim McDonald, told the reporters Sunday night, quote, "The people who are out there doing the violence, they have a hoodie on and they have face masks on. These are people who do this all the time," indicating that he and his followers, his officers, have seen many of these people before. And he said, although President Trump has claimed to have sent 2,000 National Guard troops, only 300 have been deployed. And according to local press, about 100 people have been arrested. So while the pro-British rags, like the New York Post, try to lump the violent provocateurs in together with thousands of peaceful protesters, one wonders, of course, whether President Trump is aware of the mass deportation policy is simply becoming a source of concern and disagreement, including among many of the people who voted for him, as the ICE agents are trying to fulfill an absurd, absolutely absurd deportation quotas by grabbing people when they're visiting federal offices to get legal aid, or when they're working at menial jobs just trying to scratch out a living. Now, I'm not defending one side or the other. I'm just saying I understand the protesters. But I also understand the rule of law. And I can understand why people would be upset when these illegal aliens are lining up at places in California where, according to California law, they can legally get aid, and then ICE is there waiting for them to show up, and they grab them and they put them in the vans and haul them away. Now, the question here is, who benefits? Cui bono? Who's benefiting from this? And like the Elon Musk spat with the president, was the ICE escalation and the ensuing protests timed to occur in the wake of the Trump-Putin, Trump-Xi Jinping peace talks? And another call on the 9th to Bibi Netanyahu, presumably to preempt the conversation that Netanyahu was just about to have with his cabinet concerning Iran. Is this part of the larger British-run strategy of tension? Which was my first thought. Because anytime something out of the ordinary happens, and street protesting isn't out of the ordinary, but protesting when you have agents of provocateur showing up, throwing Molotov cocktails, dressed in hoodies, faces covered. Local police say, oh, yeah, we know, that's Sam. Yeah, he comes out. Every time they cut a paycheck to pay these protesters, he shows up. And they're there with their megaphones, and they're there with their smartphones filming what's going on and sending it to other groups who pass it around to get more people to show up. When I see stuff like that, my first question again, in my mind, is always, cui bono? Who's benefiting from this? Who stands to gain from this? What else is going on that the attention on that what else is going on would be taken off to see smoke coming up from the downtown areas of Los Angeles? And of course, it's the Trump-Putin talks, and the Trump-Xi talks, and the Trump-Netanyahu talks. Now, these Marines, about 700 active duty U.S. Marines are going to show up to bolster the 2,100 federalized National Guard troops, of which only 200, to my knowledge, have showed up so far, of the 2,100. Federalized. Now, these are California National Guardsmen. And I have patients who are in the Utah National Guard, and they go for their weekend trainings, and some of them are in communication, some of them are in cyber protection, some of them are in weaponry, artillery, some of them are in the Air National Guard. I have a lot of National Guard people like that, because word gets around inside of closed communities when they find a way to get out of pain. And I don't know. Some of you may be listening to this program. It's a way for extra income. It's a way for you to satisfy some patriotic drive inside of you, which I commend, believe me, although I have no experience in the service at all. But I'm an armchair expert because I spout my expertise every time I get a microphone in front of me. And when you have the California National Guard federalized by the President of the United States in his constitutional authority to do that, even to the elimination of habeas corpus in insurrection, and all he has to say is what's going on in LA is insurrection, then these people can be rounded up and thrown in jail without their appearance before a judge or the reading of their Miranda or anything else. So I can understand why the California citizens are showing up to protest this stuff. Now, some have speculated that this is just an offshoot, a feature of the ongoing feud going on between Newsom and Trump. Now, the Los Angeles Police Department, Jim McDonald, I quoted there a minute ago, on Monday, yesterday, called for open communications between all law enforcement agencies, and he complained that there had been no formal notification to the local authorities that the Marines have been activated. So McDonald said this is a clear lack of clear coordination. It presents a significant logistical and operational challenge for those of us charged with safeguarding this city. And meanwhile, the protests are spreading nationwide, with at least 17 cities now having protests within the city. I don't know if Salt Lake is one of them or not. But the United Employees International Union, President David Huerta, was released from custody on a $50,000 bond after being detained on June 6th for allegedly blocking federal immigration agents during a raid in the LA area. And the Service Employees International Union is California's largest public sector union, and Huerta's arrest triggered further protests. And the president, April Verrett, said David Huerta was arrested while standing up for immigrants' rights. Today, a judge set him free after federal authorities attacked, injured, and unjustly sustained him. Now, I have to admit, I have very legal training. The legal training that I have experienced, for the most part, is when I've had lawyers on my radio program with interviews in the past. Oh, and that's another thing, that once I move to exclusively to stream in my broadcasts, then I can have guests on. If I have guests on now, as what happened with Harley a couple of months ago, just massive feedback. I couldn't have a guest on my stream broadcasting a K-Talk at the same time. Just terrible feedback. But that's coming. That feature will be coming here before long. Now, we've only got a few minutes before the top of the hour break. There's something very interesting that just happened out of the White House, and I just picked this up. And Trump's sudden meeting with generals and admirals on undisclosed major subjects. He just announced this at Camp David. Several generals, several admirals, and we have way too many generals. According to MacArthur, we have 44 four-star generals. In World War III, we had 3 four-star generals. World War II, we had 3 four-star generals. Anyway, while it seems clear that Trump probably was not informed for plausible deniability of Ukraine's intent to target part of Russia's nuclear triad on the 1st, only the most naive would ever believe that Western intelligence handlers weren't involved. Of course they were. So the immediate question would be, is there an active group within U.S. intelligence and or military networks that are acting outside of the Constitution and they're outside presidential oversight? So in that context, there was this very strange development this weekend. Late on June 7th, Saturday night, Trump abruptly changed his weekend schedule and added a previously unannounced meeting at Camp David. And he said this, we're going to Camp David. We have meetings with various people about various major subjects. We'll be meeting with a lot of people, including generals and admirals. Okay, I got to mute the radio broadcast. So while Trump didn't specify his subjects, and it's not yet clear what he discussed Saturday night, the media quickly acted as if they knew it was singularly about the violent confrontation in Los Angeles. Yet Trump indicated, oh, they're very major subjects. He's probably the only person on the face of the planet that talks like that. What's it about? Very major subjects. So even if the media speculation is correct, Trump had more than one such subject in mind, and it should not be excluded that Trump would not take kindly to a rump faction that went around Trump in the matter of the attack on Russia's strategic bombers. And why would the higher intelligence agencies, I talked about this yesterday, why wouldn't Tulsi Gabbard, for Pete's sake, say something to the president about this? Well, did she know? And I believe in my heart that if Trump knew what the British were planning in their attack on the nuclear triad of Russia, he would have stopped it. He would never have let it go through. Then later, Sunday evening, a White House official omitted any mention of generals or admirals attending, and apparently recasted the affair as the White House has organized what will become a regular off-campus retreat of principals attended by the president and vice president. They will meet on a number of issues and topics. Only cabinet members and White House officials were mentioned as principals. So aside from the omission of Trump's specific reference specifically to generals and admirals, it's also curious as to why an abrupt schedule change is necessitated for the beginning of what is called a regular off-campus retreat of principals. Now, I'll have more information for you on that, but that's very interesting. The president finally finds out what happened. He's on the phone with Putin, and then suddenly has this off-campus retreat of principals. He said very major subjects. So they might be discussing what's going on in LA and the inclusion of the Marines, but it might be the fact, how in the hell did I not know this? Who kept this information from me with an act of war against a nuclear-powered country? Now, had the Ukrainian side of the story been true, that they took out 41 strategic bombers, of which I think Russia has 80, that would have been half of their strategic bomber force. As I said earlier in the program, I wouldn't be doing the show because electricity would have been turned off because of 2 or 3 EMPs ignited over the U.S. continental territory. And then, of course, the only talk show I would be doing is to the immediate audience I have, a few people trying to survive amidst nuclear devastation after Utah would have been hit by several nukes. I'm serious. I'm absolutely serious when I talk like that. Which is why in my morning devotions, please keep, dear Lord, Vladimir Putin in your attention, that his patience does not start wearing thin. So yesterday, Foreign Secretary Lavrov, Russian Foreign Secretary, raised at the discussion level, I had referred to this Sarsgaard Institute's Forum of the Future, that he does not know to what extent Trump is being informed about Ukraine's terrorist attacks on Russia. And oh, this is another important point. You see what Putin has done? He's changing it from a special military operation to response to terrorism. Now, what does that mean? He's not calling it the SMO anymore. He never called it a war because he doesn't see it as a war. If this had been a war against Ukraine, it would have been over with in the first 30 days. And the civilian casualty would have been in the millions, which is what he did not want to have happen, which is one of the reasons why he's so patient, is to minimize civilian damage, while the Ukrainians go after civilian targets in Russia all the time. But that's a discussion for another time. The point I'm trying to make is how much did Trump, how suddenly, out of nowhere, Trump changes his plans for the weekend and is now bringing in, at Camp David, generals and admirals. Now, the national press is playing down. They mentioned nothing about nationals or generals or admirals. Yeah, there's something weird going on here at the radio station. Bear with me for a moment. Yeah, it just shut down. Well, I'm not going to worry about it. So Lavrov, in these questions and answers, on yesterday in this important Forum of the Future 2050 meeting, he said this: I sincerely hope that constitutional norms will prevail in America, that President Trump will not be constrained in exercising his constitutional powers, that he will not be hindered, and that he will receive all the information. I do not know how things stand with informing the president about the operations that the Ukrainian regime is conducting against our country. Now, this is a very serious comment by essentially the Secretary of State of Russia. They don't call it that. They call it the Foreign Secretary. Just like in England, the Foreign Secretary is the Secretary of State. So it's kind of Marco Rubio's counterpart. But when you hear these kinds of statements being made, when the Foreign Secretary, probably the second most important man in all of Russia, is saying, we have no idea if President Trump is being told the truth about what's going on in the Ukraine. And I can understand him saying that because of the flip-flop nature of what Trump is doing and saying anyway. So Lavrov suggested one possible avenue to examine, and he says there's a huge number of American advisors in the building of the security service of the Ukraine. Now, again, I want you to be a fly on the wall of this meeting. And the Foreign Secretary, the Secretary of State of Russia, the most powerful nuclear force on the planet, who amazingly has not launched one nuke yet, with all the attacks on the interior of their country, says there's a huge number of American advisors in the building of the security services of the Ukraine. No one has removed them. The fact that instructors from other countries who supply weapons to the Ukrainian regime are working there is also a fact. We also know that they advise the Ukrainian armed forces on planning strategic operations, deploying facilities, and camouflaging facilities. I have already mentioned that it is impossible to use a number of modern weapons without the direct participation of military personnel from the countries that supplied those weapons. And then he went on to say, of the various foreigners that are involved in the very thing he's describing, he says the British are 100%. That's all I have said since my earliest days of doing a political show at K-Talk. The British Empire is collapsing. The British Empire is fomenting wars. Look what they did in Iraq. Look what they did in Libya. Look what they did in Lebanon. Look what they did in Afghanistan. Look what they're doing in Yemen. Look what they're doing in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Sudan, Chad, Mali, trying to hold on to what is ever slipping through their fingers of their world empire. Now, if that wasn't enough, good old George Robertson, former NATO Secretary General, who received a life peerage in 2000 as an award for his loyal work on behalf of the British Empire, said in a June 8th interview with Roland Oliphant, the senior foreign correspondent for The Telegraph, that the Strategic Defense Review, quote, is really about preparing the British population for war with Russia over the long term. This is the 10th. That was printed in The Telegraph on the 8th. The former NATO Secretary General. I'm going to repeat that. The Strategic Defense Review that I quoted from in the first hour of this program, talking about dusting off Britain's nukes, is really about preparing the British population for war with Russia over the long term. Too many of the interviews I've had this week have been about money, whereas actually this report fundamentally transforms the way in which we do defense. It's a strategic review designed for 2035, not just for what we're facing at the present moment. It's to do with, and we are going to need in future, agile forces grasping the whole of technology, capturing the innovations that are coming, and I think a lot of people have missed that. Can you believe this? This is why Lavrov is saying it's 100% British. We also know that the entire fighting forces of Britain wouldn't fill an NFL stadium. And they know that, so that's why this war cry is going on, and this great effort to build the size of the British Army. When compared to the Russian army, would just be another Dunkirk. So according to Oliphant, the review's authors, who besides Robertson included General Sir Richard Barons and Fiona Hill, you remember her, are arguing that Britain's armed forces remain shaped by the post-Cold War era of small wars far away against irregular and poorly armed opponents. So he says the exquisite capabilities have masked the hollowing out of the armed forces' warfighting capability. He says stockpiles are inadequate. The strategic base lacks capacity and resilience following years of underinvestment. Medical services lack the capacity for managing a mass casualty conflict. This was just in the Telegraph yesterday. Excuse me. He said the Royal Air Force is called on to deliver deeper air and missile defense, expand its use of drones, and could be involved in discussions with the United States and NATO on the potential benefits and feasibility of enhanced UK participation in NATO's nuclear mission. Now, trying to map your way through all of that rhetoric is the simple truth. It's about militarizing the population of the UK. He said we need to have a national conversation among the British people about your defense and security. How safe do people want to be? Yeah. Oh, a little bit safe. And what are you willing to pay in order to be properly safe? What he's not saying there is how many of your existing liberties are you willing to give up to get the kind of safety a nuclear-armed England against Russia would present. He said our adversaries don't believe in business as usual, and therefore what we're doing can't be business as usual. Now, of course, the British people would be so much safer if the royal establishment would stop its drive to provoke a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. But the consequences of British geopolitical policy are never mentioned. All right. Now, a couple of more things here. I'm sorry, I'm just a little dry, just shouting and I'm trying to talk. Now, I said last week, after the response by Russia to the Ukraine and all of the defense communication center stuff in Kyiv and surrounding areas that were attacked by retaliatory attacks by Russia against Ukraine. I said then, and I repeat myself, that's just the beginning. There wasn't just one attack. In fact, I don't think that's the big attack the Russians have planned for the Ukraine in response to the strike on their nuclear triad. And the triad essentially is their nuclear submarines, nuclear bombers, and their missiles. And so their missiles weren't attacked, their submarines weren't attacked, but their bombers were attacked, of which it looks like they got 7 of them, and 3 of them apparently were decommissioned to the point they didn't even have engines on the wings. But they have to be out there on the airfield according to the START treaties. We have to be able to see through satellite images the Russian bombers sitting on the ground, just like at Barksdale, at Minot, where our B-52s are stationed. They're sitting out on the tarmac, so the Russian satellites can see where our bombers are, as opposed to being in the air. Excuse me. So, in the midst of this, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a statement yesterday reporting that the Russians have launched another retaliatory strike on the Ukrainian military targets overnight. And the Russian forces, the statement said, launched a massive high-precision strike by long-range air-to-surface missiles, weapons on one of the AFU tactical aviation airfields near Dubno in the Rovno region, which is about 340 kilometers west of Kyiv. And the statement said the attack was one of the retaliatory strikes in response to the terrorist attacks conducted by the Kyiv regime on Russian military airfields, which is the first time that attack has been described as a terrorist attack. Oh, I got distracted during the first hour of the show. This changes everything. If Russia considers the warfare against Russia now being instigated by the Ukrainians as terrorism, as opposed to the Ukrainians' defensive posturing against the special military operation of the Russians coming into the Ukraine to protect the ethnic Russians from further genocide at the hands of the Nazi-led Kyiv regime, it changes everything. It's just like what Trump did, calling the cartels below the Rio Grande as terrorist organizations. Because according to United States law, and I suspect the Russians have similar laws, it's one thing to have to deal with a military group that's poking you in the side with a sharp stick, as opposed to a terrorist group. When something is designated a terrorist group, the rules of engagement change. And so now Russia is describing the Kyiv regime as a terrorist group. What does that mean? That means you kill the leaders. You kill the generals. You kill the admirals. Before, there are certain rules of engagement. War, fighting against whatever. Just like it was highlighted, I think, towards the end of World War II, when a lot of the German Wehrmacht officers, not necessarily Nazis, some of them were, but the German Wehrmacht officers, when they were captured as prisoners of war, were not only treated with respect, they were allowed to keep their weapon on their waist, their hand weapon. They just had to stop the military engagement, stop the hostilities. And so that's because one war, in the war, both sides recognize certain accepted agreements, some of which are based on mutual agreements that have gone on for decades, if not 100 years or so, the priority of taking care of officers, and the dignified treatment that they should get. But it's another thing when you're dealing with a terrorist organization. That means, in my mind, if I understand that correctly, Zelensky's got a big red circle on his chest right now and could be taken out by Russian forces of whatever as a result of responding to terrorist attacks. Now, is it okay for Russia to call what happened to their triad, nuclear triad, a terrorist attack? So in addition to this attack that just happened the other night, as one of continuing attacks that are going to go on for a while against the Ukraine, the high-precision strike by long-range air-to-surface weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles struck enterprises producing weapons and military hardware, assembly workshops for attack drones, as well as ammunition, weapons, and military hardware depots of the AFU. The Ukrainian General Staff acknowledged a large-scale Russian attack with 499 missiles and drones, but claimed the Ukrainian air defenses downed 479 of them, claiming that only 20 got through. I have a hard time believing that. They also claimed in their attack on Russia, a defense industry facility where receivers for Shahad drones were produced has been hit. The target was struck by at least 2 UAVs, followed by large-scale fire. The consequences of the strike still being confirmed. Now, K-Talk's got something going on. All right, I'm going to put them on pause. For the streamers, I hope that's doesn't sound condescending. I want to talk about what happened for a few minutes here 58 years ago, June 8th. That would have been Sunday. 58 years ago was this Sunday, June the 8th, was the 58th anniversary of the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty, which was a U.S. Navy signals intelligence ship, which was deployed off the coast of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula during the June 1967 Arab-Israeli War to collect intelligence on both the Israelis and the Egyptians. And the attack killed 34 members of the crew and wounded 171 others. And Israel officially apologized to U.S. President Johnson for the attack, but claimed that the Israelis mistook the U.S. Liberty for a smaller Egyptian cargo vessel that was underway closer to the coast, an explanation that not even accepted by U.S. Secretary of Defense or State Dean Rusk at the time. He said, "I was never satisfied with the Israeli explanation," Rusk wrote in his memoir published in 1991. He said, "Their sustained attack to disable and sink the Liberty precluded an assault by accident or some trigger-happy local commander. Through diplomatic channels, we refused to accept their explanations. I didn't believe them then. I don't believe them to this day. That attack was outrageous." Surviving members of the crew always maintained that the Israelis identified the Liberty for what it was. The ship could be identified by its hull number, GTR 5, and it flew a huge American flag off the stern. 2 signs of its identity that could not be missed. So according to an Israeli account, the maritime observer aboard Israeli surveillance aircraft identified the USS Liberty as a U.S. Navy vessel a few hours before the attack, because surviving members of the crew, Liberty crew, said Israeli jets were out there flying circles around the boat. They could see what it was. They could see the American flag. They could see the hull numbers. And you think the Air Force of one country looking at the naval ships of another country don't know how to read those numbers and know what they mean and immediately have in their notes? Oh, this is an intelligence gathering boat. So for a few hours before the attack, they were circled by these jets. Then the U.S. Liberty crew members testified the attack persisted for more than an hour with repeated passes by Israeli torpedo boats and aircraft with the clear intent of sinking the ship. So President Johnson's desire to hush up the whole incident was evident in the treatment of Liberty's commander, Captain William McGonigal. McGonigal, who sustained numerous serious wounds during the attack, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroic efforts to save the ship. Normally, the Medal of Honor is presented to the recipient by the President in a White House ceremony, but McGonigal was given his by the Secretary of the Navy during a closed ceremony at the Washington Naval Yard. And dozens of other crew members were also awarded medals, along with orders, "Do not talk about the attack." You know where Leavenworth is. Don't talk about the attack. As for why the Israelis attacked the Liberty, retired Naval Lieutenant Commander James Ennis, a junior officer on Liberty's bridge at the time of the attack, and author of the 1987 book Assault on the Liberty, charged that the Israelis were about to launch an attack to occupy Syria's Golan Heights and didn't want their plans discovered beforehand. So historian George Lenkowitzki, in his 1990 book American Presidents in the Middle East, explained that while the Israeli decision to attack and destroy the ship may appear puzzling, the clarity seems to be found in Liberty's nature and its task to monitor communications from both sides of the war zone. And he wrote that timely knowledge of Israel's decision to invade Syria and preparatory moves toward that might have frustrated Israelis' designs for the conquest of Syria's Golan Heights, and in the sense of Ennis's accusation, provides a plausible thesis that Israel deliberately decided to incapacitate the signals collecting American ship and leave no one left alive to tell the story of the attack. What has America done since then? Well, they buried it. They buried it as best they can, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to hide the truth for very long. Now, another interesting thing, you know, not the ceasefire that was going to go on between, that the Ukrainians want. The Russians say, no way is there going to be a ceasefire. We know damn well what will happen in a ceasefire. You'll have a chance to rearm. And we're not going to put up with that for 1 second. You can bet your bottom dollar we're not going to put up with that for 1 second. But sir, it's an American ship. Never mind, hit her when the Israelis attacked the USS Liberty. Thank you, Sammer. Appreciate that. All right. Now, the 48-hour ceasefire that the Russians were calling for, not the 30-day ceasefire, the 48-hour ceasefire, was to exchange prisoners of war and to show up with the refrigerated trucks with the dead of the other side so that they can get them and take them to their families and have closure and bury them. Well, a former Ukrainian member of parliament is claiming Zelensky personally refused to accept his war debt. Ukraine's Rada is processing after the June 2nd offer of the Russian negotiators to return the bodies of 6,000 fallen Ukrainian soldiers. New legislation that would delay the declaration of a soldier's death until 2 years after the hostilities cease. That declaration of death is necessary for the family members to collect the $362,000 due to them from the government. Further, the family would then have to file and go to court where the government could still avoid the compensation. And the mere consideration of such a bill adds fuel to the firestorm that has broken out over Kyiv's manifest reluctance to claim the bodies of their soldiers. So when Putin said, yeah, 48 hours, we'll swap prisoners of war and we'll swap the dead. Now, Russia's lead negotiator, Vladimir Bedinsky, had described how the Ukrainian negotiators had initially expressed interest in Russia's offer, no strings attached, to hand over the deceased. And they consulted Kyiv, and 2 hours later, the offer was rejected. So yesterday, Russian Foreign Minister spokesman Maria Zakharova wondered aloud on her Telegram channel, quote, was it Zelensky's personal decision not to collect the bodies of Ukrainians, or did someone from NATO forbid it? Now, the Ukrainian lawmaker, Artem Dmytryk, is naming Ukraine's acting president, Volodymyr Zelensky, as the one who personally blocked the offer. Dmytryk, who's a critic of Zelensky, had fled Ukraine a year ago after publicly opposing the government's crackdown on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And yesterday he said, I know Zelensky issued a personal order not to accept the bodies of the Ukrainian military men who were killed in action. And this situation can become cathartic, so to say. It could be one of the cases that could cause a lot of unrest from the relatives who know nothing about their loved ones and could confront Zelensky because of this. They're appropriating the money that belongs to the families of the dead and the wounded. Zelensky is used to stealing it via his proxies. He then added that the new law introduced last week is just another way to legalize his crimes. Just imagine, 2 years after the end of the war, and we don't know when and how it will end, yet they're already establishing this framework. Dmytryk, who once belonged to Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, described Ukraine's current leadership as a party of war that has suppressed any dissent. He said that members of their peace camp have been assassinated, they've been imprisoned, they've been forced into exile, meaning that no political change can occur if both Moscow and Washington agree. No good can be expected from this terrorist regime, he said, and calling for fresh elections in the Ukraine. Well, that's not going to happen. But that's why Zelensky is refusing to receive the dead. The dead have shown up in refrigerated trucks. 6,000 Ukrainian dead. Who knows what various levels of degeneration the bodies have gone through since they died, but they're refrigerated to retard it to some degree. And I suppose they have their dog tags hanging around their neck to identify them. But if they do, well, everybody's sending in a bunch of stuff here. I don't have the ability to play this stuff without terrible feedback at K-Talk. I'll look at it later and maybe I could present it next week or something. Okay, now, we all know that Israel has nukes. We've known for a long time that Israel has nukes, which is in violation. I forget what act it was, but you can't give military aid to a country with nuclear weapons. And so that's why some people, thanks, Paul, that's why some people have gotten quite upset about this whole thing over the fact that we have given so much money to Israel for military reasons or usage while they're a nuclear-armed country, which they, of course, deny. Now, it's interesting, the question that's being asked, has Iran carried out its own nuclear vault coup against Israel? So 2 reports came out yesterday claiming that Iranian intelligence had acquired a huge trove of secret documents detailing, among other things, Israel's nuclear weapons program. And according to Tasnim, the IRIB news agency quoted informed sources as saying on Saturday that the Iranian intelligence forces had obtained a considerable amount of data as well as strategic and sensitive documents of the Zionist regime, including thousands of documents on its nuclear plans and facilities. The documents have reportedly been taken out of Israel. Now, al-Mayadeen, in what is called an exclusive, reported that Iran's intelligence services have successfully obtained a vast trove of highly classified strategic documents and information tied to Israel. And well-informed sources told al-Mayadeen that the data included thousands of documents related to the Israeli occupation's projects and its nuclear facilities. And it has been confirmed that the entire cache of documents reached the designated secure location, adding that the volume of material is so vast that simply reviewing the documents along with their accompanying photos and videos is going to take an exceptionally long time. Now, was that enough to fill a U-Haul trailer or truck? How did they get that out of Israel? How did it get delivered to Iran? But apparently, it is a treasure trove of all of the documentation to support what everybody else already knows, that Israel has denied that they have a nuclear weapon. Well, there are those who claim in the Negev desert under the sand, there's at least 30, was the last number I heard, 30 nuclear missiles. I don't know if that's true. All right, the Hunger Games, of course, continue in Gaza. Oh, just unbelievable. I might get back to this. This is just so disturbing. I mean, USAID, what's left of it, was considering giving $500 million to the Gaza operation to get this food, this medicine into the Gaza. And all of this was coming out, according to two knowledgeable sources and U.S. officials, a move that would involve the U.S. more deeply in a controversial aid effort that has been beset by violence and chaos. The plan has met resistance from some U.S. officials concerned with the deadly shootings of Palestinians near aid distribution sites and the competence of the GHF, the two sources said. Boy, if that just doesn't break your heart, what would? Even people showing up to give aid, all of the journalists who've been on the ground in Gaza trying to report what's going on are dead. Babies showing up at hospitals manned by Doctors Without Borders have bullet holes in their skulls. And the doctors are very clear about it. These aren't shrapnel holes. These are bullet holes. All right. The question up until this morning was Trump going to send in the Marines to Los Angeles? Well, they're there. They're arriving. And as you've seen the rapid escalation of protest in the Los Angeles area, stemming from a series of raids conducted by ICE, which began last Friday. And ICE, of course, is the enforcement arm of the Department of Homeland Security that's tasked with protecting Americans against illegal immigration and transnational crime. So on Friday, the ICE began raids at various locations in Los Angeles and arrested at least 44 people. This action provoked the protests, which demonstrators surrounding and blocking access to the Edward R. Roybal Federal Building in downtown LA, where the detainees were being processed. So the demonstrations and clashes with the federal agents continued right through Saturday. Then the Department of Homeland Security said in a statement, 1,000 rioters surrounded a federal law enforcement building and assaulted ICE law enforcement officers, slashed tires, defaced buildings, and taxpayer-funded property. So Stephen Miller, and everybody loves Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and just a rabid anti-immigration hardliner, said Friday's demonstrations were an insurrection against the laws and sovereignty of the United States. So Trump administration said they're going to send in 2,000 National Guard troops to quell the riposte, which they have done. And then Pete Hegseth posted this on his X account. The violent mob assaults on ICE and federal law enforcement are designed to prevent the removal of criminal, illegal aliens from our soil, a dangerous invasion facilitated by criminal cartels, and a huge national security risk. Under President Trump, violence and destruction against federal agents and federal facilities will not be tolerated. It's common sense that the Department of Defense is mobilizing the National Guard immediately to support the federal law enforcement in Los Angeles. And if violence continues, active duty Marines at Camp Pendleton will be mobilized. They are on high alert. That was from yesterday, and of course today. I saw the pictures this morning on the news before the radio show of these vans, several of them in a row, apparently carrying 700 Marines. Now, National Guard troops have deployed to Los Angeles previously back in 2020 during the widespread riots after the death of George Floyd, and are generally under the control of the state, but this previous action was coordinated with the mayor of Los Angeles and Governor Newsom. And so both Newsom and the current mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, have expressed alarm, of course, at Trump's decision to deploy the National Guard without consultation. And Newsom posted on X, he said, the Secretary of Defense is now threatening to deploy active duty Marines on American soil against its own citizens. This is deranged behavior. Now, is it in fact against their own citizens? Are these illegal aliens citizens of the United States? So the use of, just by way of review here, posse comitatus. The use of military against civilians of the United States is generally restricted by law, primarily by the Posse Comitatus Act of over 100 years ago. And this act prohibits the use of federal troops to enforce civilian law, with exceptions for situations authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. And some of the exceptions are the Insurrection Act, which allows the president to deploy troops domestically to suppress rebellion or domestic violence. And number two, the president can also deploy troops, even without the request of the state into which he deploys them, to enforce federal law or suppress a rebellion against federal authority when ordinary legal processes are insufficient. So there have been times in American history, and especially in recent American history, where a president, in response to the refusal of local elected officials to deploy state forces of the National Guard in constitutional enforcement of the law, has overridden said local officials. So in March of 1965, on the eve of the famous Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, then President Lyndon Johnson responded to Alabama Governor George Wallace's pro-segregationist refusal to call out the National Guard to protect the marchers. So Johnson invoked his legal authority to activate the National Guard, and he explained to the American people at a press conference at the LBJ Ranch in Texas, quote, I am calling into federal service selected units of the Alabama National Guard, and also will have available police units from the regular Army to help you meet your state responsibilities to protect law-abiding citizens. These forces should be adequate to assure the rights of American citizens pursuant to a federal court order to walk peaceably and safely without injury or loss of life from Selma to Montgomery. In the current case, it appears that local officials were not consulted at all prior to the decision being taken to deploy the National Guard, end quote. So the last time the military was called up against the civilians was in 1992 by President George Herbert Walker Bush to quell the civil unrest in LA after the murder of Rodney King. And the problems of coordination among the multiple law enforcement agencies with the military and the implications for the individual citizen are illustrated in the following instance here with this one report that I quote. In one notorious incident, the Marines and police were called to respond to a domestic disturbance at a local home. When the officers arrived, the inhabitants fired a shotgun through the front door. A policeman yelled, "Cover me," which means hold your fire, but be prepared to shoot as necessary. The Marines, however, responded instantly in the way they had been trained, where cover me means provide cover with using firepower. The soldiers then opened up fire on the residents, shooting more than 200 bullets into the front of the house. Miraculously, no one was killed. But the implications, including our Constitution, needed to be discussed. So, what do we have here? About 15 minutes left. I got to say something about number one on my traders list, Lindsey Graham. Trump's lack of enthusiasm for the Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal sponsored draconian sanctions bill against Russia may just have been brought to a halt, thank goodness. Because according to a report posted by Bloomberg Sunday, I think it was, despite having a veto-proof majority, the supporters show no sign that they're ready to challenge the president. If it went through the House and it got passed by the Senate, it would be passed by enough senators that Trump could not veto it. But it seems to have slowed down. Now, Trump's comments on Thursday, he said he hadn't even looked at the bill, but will do what he wants at the right time. So put the brakes on what seemed to be an accelerating push to advance the proposal as soon as they thought it would get passed maybe this week. So Lindsey Graham, who said earlier last week that he aimed to have the Senate plan in place by the time, excuse me, that he aimed to have the Senate plan by the time of the G7 summit on June 15th to 17th, seemed to ease the gas off a little bit in a tweet from Trump's comments where he said, "I have coordinated closely with the White House on this endeavor from day one." But Trump apparently has shown very little interest in backing Graham's plan, and the White House has insisted that any decision on sanctions is the president's purview. And of course, you know that the bill would impose a 500% tariff on any of the nations benefiting by products from Russia. And the majority of the oil and gas coming out of Russia go to India and China. And so this bill would have put a 500% tariff on anything coming out of India or China into the United States. That's how crazy these lunatics are. Now, you have often heard me recommend for your continuing education the Judge Napolitano podcast, Judging Freedom. On June 7th, Max Blumenthal, who's one of my favorites, who is a Jewish fellow, but he's not a Zionist, and just is an anti-genocidalist, doesn't support Hamas by any means, but he doesn't support the starvation of the Palestinians either, as an increasing number of Jews in Israel have taken to cast. But Max Blumenthal, back on the 7th, laid out the case that it is the British who have taken complete control of the proxy war against Russia. He said MI6 was responsible for the terrorism and the drone attacks preceding the June 2nd negotiations in Istanbul, adding that it is highly likely that the CIA knew about the plans and may have been involved. You think? He cited Project Alchemy as a secret cell within the British military intelligence which prepared the detailed battle plans against Russia. And Project Alchemy was exposed by the Gray Zone's journalist Kit Clarenberg. And he concluded that whether Trump was aware of it or not, it represents a very serious attack on Trump's ability to negotiate with the Russians. He said the attacks, which the Ukrainians said have been planning for 18 months, were timed to break the diplomatic efforts that were underway. And on the British role, he said, the Five Eyes have rendered Trump blind. So the last section of the interview took up the role of Alex Karp and Palantir, which is a tech firm, you're familiar with that, which is fully integrated into the surveillance and data collection operations of the military-industrial complex. He ended by saying that while MAGA the MAGA faithful are hostile to the role of private tech firms such as Palantir, Trump has remained silent on this issue. Now, a little bit more, another news feed I have here on new sanctions. Graham's comments, new sanctions, whether he can get them through or not, will be bone crushing. When I saw images of Lindsey Graham with his arm around Zelensky in the Ukraine last week, fomenting actions that would result in an expression of congressional power against the president, which is the right of Congress to do. I understand that. But with this sanctioning the Russia Act of 2025, Senate Bill 1241, it's kind of like Dr. Strangelove's descent into the thermonuclear maelstrom, threatening to drag others down with him. You remember the end of Dr. Strangelove. So here you have the witless, acting patriotic, but just the opposite, Senator Lindsey Graham, proposing this bill, which would impose a 500% tariff on any country that buys Russian energy, with a carve-out to spare those countries which are significantly supporting the Ukraine, even though they get fuel from Russia. The bill is Senate Bill 1241. This bill will have the effect, of course, of the U.S. shooting itself in the head, according to Politico and other political analysts who have pointed out that China and India together buy about 70% of Russia's energy exports. And a 500% tariff against goods imported from China would send prices into the stratosphere. And it would disrupt supply chains, would drive U.S. unemployment to recessionary levels, Politico said. So in his coverage of the bill, RT said, U.S. Senator Rand Paul wrote in the publication Responsible Statecraft that the bill essentially amounts to an embargo and could trigger economic calamity on the scale never before seen in our country. He added that such punitive measures are unlikely to change Moscow's core strategic goals and only further entrench the U.S. in a failing foreign policy approach. Said the sanctions bill was introduced in early April by a bipartisan group of senators led by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal. In addition to 500% tariffs, the measure includes secondary sanctions targeting countries that maintain commercial ties with Moscow. The senator described the bill as one of the most draconian sanction bills ever written and the sanctions as bone-crushing. Well, there's one small little twist in all of that. Because one of the major sources of imported uranium for America's nuclear energy power plants comes from, Russia. So the question is asked, is Lindsey Graham stupid enough to sanction itself? Would we suddenly be paying 500% more in tariffs in order to get our nuclear material from Russia that they are producing at a far greater degree than we are? All right. One of the speculations out there in Russia's response to the nuclear triad attack on their air bases was maybe not peppering Ukraine with the Oreshnik missiles. Oh, that's another thing, that friend of mine. Those of you who are listening from the very beginning of this show, I started off the question, why do people believe the opposite? Why are they so fervently in believing the opposite of what's actually happening? This friend of mine, patient friend, a legalized American citizen, but from an Eastern European country. Very anti-Russian. I asked him, I said, well, he's talking about how the Russian army is being destroyed day by day by day by the Ukrainian army. And I stood there and stared at him like he was talking to me in Mandarin or something. And I said, what about the Oreshnik missile? The Russians could pepper to a much greater degree than they have. They've only been restrained because they want to limit civilian casualties of the Ukrainians. But they could pepper Ukraine with these Oreshniks. And he said, oh, the Oreshnik is a fraud. It's not real. I said, well, if you were standing in the Rheinmetall building there in the Donetsk Oblast when that missile landed, you might have a different opinion. Oh, that's just propaganda. No matter what I said in defense of my position that the war is over with and Russia has won it, it was always, oh, that's propaganda. That's propaganda, Jack. Jack, you're just believing propaganda. Well, I suggested that instead of peppering the Ukraine, and I'll finish with this idea, with the Oreshnik missiles, maybe they'll just speed up the Russian advance towards Kyiv of the ground forces, because they have control of the ground. So Sunday night, the armed forces of the Russian Federation carried out these group strikes by these high-precision, long-range weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles at the Ukrainian defense industry enterprises, the workshops that manufacturing strike unmanned aerial vehicles, the maintenance facilities, the weapons and hardware repairing centers, as well as ammunition depots. And the Kyiv regime reported that the Russians launched 215 aerial attack assets to strike Ukraine on the night of 6-7 June, but claimed 174 of them failed to reach their targets as a result of combination of gunfire and suppression by electronic warfare. The Ukrainians reported another mass strike aimed at targets in the Kharkov and Donetsk regions Sunday morning with 49 drones and 3 missiles, claiming the Ukrainian air defenses took down 40 of the drones. Now, so the Western pundits, as I said earlier, are looking for the Oreshnik missiles as proof of the retaliation for the June 1 drone attacks against Russian airfields and the terrorist attacks on rail infrastructure where a lot of innocents were killed. But so far, the Russians haven't used any. And the U.S. officials told Reuters yesterday that the U.S. believes the Russian President Vladimir Putin threatened retaliation against Ukraine over its drone attack this last weekend, but nothing's happened yet. And so they're thinking, well, it's going to be a multi-tipped strike. But I think what's going to happen is there aren't going to be missile attacks. They're just going to increase the advance of the Russian army further and further into Kyiv. So I think we're done at K-Talk for the day. It won't do any good to save that. That's gone. It's just the streamers. And so I think this is what you're going to see. A much more orchestrated, much heavier, much higher, heavier manned Russian forces attack on the ground forces, taking more and more and more of the ground in eastern Ukraine, right to the Dnieper River, securing Kharkiv, securing Odessa, and getting ready to march on Kyiv if Kyiv doesn't accept the terms of surrender that the Russians have already offered. All right. I got a bunch of other stuff, but there's no time to get into the rest of it. I greatly appreciate your leadership, those of you who are on the stream. If you can share what? Oh, yeah, thank you. Mark, is it? Or Mar? My husband and I actually remember your interview with Kay Henry. Are you kidding me? Miss Fiske? Oh, I shouldn't say your last name. You actually remember my interview with Kay Henry. That was in March of 1995. My goodness, long-time listener, I guess. What a great idea. We've always said YouTube was the answer to KTKK staying active. Yeah, and I think more and more of the talk show hosts at K-Talk will do that. I think they're going to get the idea that they want to survive, they're going to have to do it this way. So, well, thank you, Mar. I appreciate your comments here very much. Thank you very, very much. That empowers me to do more of this. So that's it for Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell. I will be back tomorrow with breaking health barriers and some health topics I think you'll find just as interesting as the strategic topics